just one? All five?
Yes, that we're shooting for all five. Good evening, everyone. We are Group 5, as we stated, shooting for all fives. I'm Hayden. I'm with Danielle, Xavier, Haroon, and Caitlin. We're going to be talking about the microchip shortage as it affects Ford specifically, but we're going to kind of touch on different aspects of the car industry. We're passing around a handout that's kind of like what Michelle sent out earlier for their group, so you guys can write your report, and some parts. There's 2 pieces you can kind of play with and see. We'll talk about why we're playing with car parts a little later. So the first thing we wanted to start out with was with a question and kind of your thoughts on Ford. People sometimes have really strong brand loyalty, especially for expensive things like cars. Ford kind of coined the term for FORD first on race day, but a lot of people don't have the same opinion, so they coined the term found on road dead. So we're gonna see what anyone thought of just experiences, hate Ford, love Ford, just blurt it out.
I drive a Ford.
Yeah.
Okay. But do you love your Ford?
I've driven 2 Fords, and I don't know, I think they're okay.
I wasn't a big fan of my Ford Focus.
Yeah.
I can't say that I have any personal experience with driving a Ford, but I will say that from when I was a little kid, I was just told, I guess, that Toyota and Ford has really good cars, and that was kind of the impression that I had from a very young age. Now I don't see a lot of Ford cars driving around, but I still have that impression that they are really sturdy, good cars. I could be completely off, but...
Well, I think they want you to think that they're that, but yeah. All right, cool. If anyone else has anything else, we'll continue on. So we're gonna kind of give just a brief history of microchips, since we're gonna be talking about them, just to kind of give you the technical details. They were first engineered for cars by Bosch Automotive in 1968 for VW, because Bosch is a German company. VW is also a German company. They worked hand in hand, and it was to create fuel injection as a computer system, as opposed to the old carbureted system, and that's this one up here. It was supposed to be Volkswagen's electronic brain. It's smarter than a carburetor, and that's their original ad campaign for it. And then down below is what they thought that microchips would turn cars into in the future, and they actually did a pretty good job predicting what cars would look like with screens in the middle and stuff. So then subsequently, we're gonna dive into how the first chips were used with a Ford product, and that was 1 year later in 1969. It was used for an anti-skid system, which is kind of like the ABS light if it's ever been on in your car. It's kind of that first wave of defense if you start to get out of control. That was sort of something they started to design in-house, and then Ford started to realize that they couldn't do this on their own forever, but they took a stab at it, and in 1974 they had their first engine control computer to kind of compete with getting rid of carbureted systems and regulating that. But then, like chapter 8 in the book talks about the IMNDP book. In 1983, Ford partnered with Intel, which was, it said that was like an effort of outsourcing, because they realized that they weren't capable of fully doing it in-house. They figured it was better if they moved it to somebody who had an expertise in computers, which was Intel in the 80s. And that lasted until 1994 when they transitioned to Motorola. As cars started to get more technical and with more chips and more systems, there started to become a standard code or a standard use case for how the chips had to talk to each other, and it was a network that was developed so that all the different chips could be on the same, kind of like an internal internet in your car. And that was sort of where Motorola had their stake, so Ford partnered with them to make microcontrollers to spread the data throughout the car. And that lasted for a while, and then the other biggest piece to note was that because of the chip shortage, which I know a couple of us will touch on in different levels of depth later, in 2021, Ford partnered with Global Foundries for in-house design chips. So they were going to move away from relying on other people designing chips that then they put in their cars. Basically, other people were making, we offer X, Y, Z, and you can put it in however you want, and now they're saying, hey, what do you want, and we will build it for you. So it's kind of a different wave for them, and I think that will allow them much more freedom in the future as they progress with that. So this leads us to where they are today with microchips. So one of the biggest things, I'm sure James you've used if you have in your car, Ford Sync is they worked with Microsoft on infotainment, which is just in-car navigation and radio. So if you've ever made a phone call in a Ford, we have another piece to pass around too, but this one has all the buttons and stuff on it. This is just a radio from a car. So the reason we pass around both of these is that something as simple as turn signals or HVAC buttons and radio controls are all controlled by microcomputers. The turn signals in that are its own computer to the network. Everything is part of the computer of the car anymore. So that is why Ford is relying so heavily, and that's why they just say it's not just, they can't get touchscreens anymore. They can't even make turn signals right now. I mean, they have a lot of chip shortages. So that's sort of where Ford partnered with SIG to get the chips to do that for a while. And then the other big player is Bosch. Ford gets a lot of their safety systems. Bosch is kind of a leader and innovator in the radar stuff for cruise control and all the different cameras that cars have nowadays. And Ford is transitioning to work with Global Foundries, which also is working with GM. That's sort of a consortium, which is what the book describes is like an R&D consortium. Global Foundries is going to work with GM and Ford to sort of make pieces away to make them here. They're going to they have to reinvent the wheel because they can't steal technology that's proprietary to other companies like Bosch. So they have to make them here in the US under a different name, but they're basically just starting from scratch again to make things over again so that they can make them here in the US. They're based in New York, so they're hoping to start production here shortly, but it was all sort of initiated in the last couple of months, so they haven't really started fully transitioning over just yet. And then this leads us with the COVID-specific impacts on Ford. So this graph at the top is not indicative to just Ford. This is all car production for all manufacturers from 2000 to 2021. You can see a dip for the financial recession in 8, 9, and 10, which subsequently picked up like a rocket ship and went to the top and started tanking in late 2019 and then absolutely plummeted in 2020. And it still can't get back up to where it was because there are no chips. So one of the use case, or the result of that is that there's 7.7 million fewer cars this year alone predicted because they're sitting on lots. So there's two ways that different companies are trying to combat this right now. There's a few, but the two big strategies we can see in Ford and GM for what they're doing. So Ford has decided that instead of sending out cars that are incomplete or have less features, they're just scaling back the number of cars they're able to send to dealers to be bought. So they're just sitting on lots right now in Michigan, waiting to be finished with parts when they come from wherever the factories are that's producing the chips that are needed for whatever they're missing. Whereas GM and a couple of their companies, we have a picture here, they are just sending cars out that are missing features like heated seats, and the button just won't work, and they'll just tell you later on, we'll just give you that when we get the chips. So there's kind of two ways to do that. You can either send the cars out to make production volume up and seem like you're doing well, but cars are not coming. You can buy a $70,000 car that doesn't have heated seats. Or they're doing what Ford's doing and just holding onto those cars until they can guarantee that it's ready to go. So there's just a couple different ways to do that. And some examples we found was that BMW stopped offering touchscreens in many of its vehicles. Nissan dropped navigation systems in all of its vehicles. Mercedes took away all of its advanced headlight systems because those take a lot of chips to work, as well as all premium audio. And Chrysler laid off about 300 workers in Indiana because it couldn't get chips for its automatic transmissions. So it's affecting sort of every brand, regardless of price point, prestige. No one's immune to it right now. It's just kind of unprecedented for everyone, and everyone's trying to figure out ways to get around that. With that being said, I think we're going to move into the history of Ford's leadership and how they got to where they are today.
Hi, my name is Haroon. I want to thank James for donating his car parts that we took out of his car during the break, so we'll put them back, don't worry. So, he's like, it looks familiar. I'm going to talk a little bit about Ford's strategic leadership, and the reason we want to bring that into the discussion is because a lot of things that Hayden just talked about is how does a company make decisions about what will happen in the future, and how to do this develop strategy. Those are important things, and people who are involved in it, we're going to talk a little bit about that. So Ford is an iconic name. It's been around since 1903, obviously started by Henry Ford, and then he revolutionized how cars are produced, and it made it cheaper through mass production and available for average families to buy. And then the Ford family has been just pretty part of the Ford Motor Company since then in one way or another. So here on the screen, you're going to see some people that I'm going to highlight over the years who've taken the leadership role at Ford, who in particular have been CEOs of the company. Obviously, Henry Ford up to World War II, post-World War II. Henry Ford II was there till 1979. And a big thing that happened under his leadership was the fact that Ford went in the 1960s, became a publicly traded company. And then the family continued to be leaders in the company. So William Clay Ford, who was CEO and still remains an active board member and executive chair is the new title he has. And he brought in Alan Mulally to be CEO during a very critical time, and that's the big dip that you saw in car manufacturing during the Great Recession. And a lot of auto manufacturers were in a lot of trouble and were on the brink of bankruptcy. Well, Ford was the only company under Mulally's leadership that came through without going bankrupt and not asking for a government bailout. And that was a lot part of the decisions they made as an organization. He is also credited for bringing the current people in the company, such as James Farley, who's little known fact, he's a cousin of the comedian Farley, who died back in I think the 90s. So he brought in James Farley and some of the other people. Some of the other folks he brought in came from Tesla and Apple back in early mid 2000s and have been part of the organization, kind of helping move the organization. And lastly, I'm going to take a little bit about what decisions that the current CEO has made and how that's impacted. But before I go any further, I want to kind of highlight what is it that a strategic leader is doing and what are they doing at their level as a C-suite leader to like the decisions they make. Why does that matter? Well, it's their responsibility to use the power and influence they have to move the organization along its organizational objectives, and that's their big charge that's given to them by the boards, by the stakeholders. They use power, so power can come from their vested power in the office as a CEO, but they also use influence. So if you go back to the first day of our class, we talked a lot about soft skills, and that's influence. That's building the relationships with union leaders, being able to build relationships with communities and with government relations. So all that comes through both power and influence. So for Farley, for example, the CEO, he's working at the headquarters level. They're developing the corporate strategy. And at that level, the organization is really trying to figure out where should we compete? Where do we compete? And we'll talk a little bit about throughout our day today, our presentation today, like how Ford made decisions to compete in certain areas. And that's the corporate decision, the corporate strategy. Below that is the business strategy. The business strategy is really figuring out how do we do that? How do we compete? Do we compete on cost? Do we compete on differentiation? Or do we compete on innovation? And lastly is the functional strategy. The functional strategy is really the implementation of those ideas. And those are the different levels you will see leaders working at. So the AFI framework, or the analysis, formulation, implementation framework, takes some of those ideas and how do these leaders develop the ideas of strategy? They take the analysis, which happens by looking at the vision, mission, and the values of the organization and building that together. As a CEO or the strategic leader, they're really the ones who gonna have this vision of like, this is where I want to see the company go. The board gives them the charge, yes, go forth with that. And then they drive with the external and internal analysis, the strategies that we talked about, the corporate strategy, the business strategy, and the functional strategy. And they lastly implement that through the governance structure of the firm. So a little bit about Farley. Farley is known as a car guy. Here he is with his vintage Ford that he races. His grandfather worked in a Ford plant going back into the early 1900s, so he has some family history to the company. But he originally came up through IBM, worked at Toyota, kind of kicking off the Lexus as a luxury brand for Toyota back in those days, and he was part of that leadership team and was recruited to come to Ford in 2007. and he was promoted to CEO from within the organization just a few years ago. I want to highlight some of the changes that Ford made that not only Hayden has mentioned, but also Xavier will talk a little bit about. And these decisions kind of changed the way they responded to both what's going on with COVID and the chip shortage. One of the major decisions they made is that they're going to bring in their own battery production to their own factories. In the past, they were resourced from outside. They would just buy them. Now they're going to make their own. Second important decision that they made was that they decided to split the internal combustion engine part of it, which is they call Blue Ford, separate from the other the electric vehicle side, which is called Mach-E. So they split the organization, but kept it under the same umbrella of Ford. And we'll talk a little bit. Xavier's going to talk a little bit more about that. And lastly, they recognize that the future for Ford goes into a subscription model, and that is allowing the customers to download features for their vehicle and paying a subscription for it. So if you want certain feature in your car and you're like, yeah, I'll pay $15 a month for that kind of feature, then you can add that. Or if you don't want it, you don't have to select that. And as they update cars and they update features, you may get something that you didn't originally have when you first bought the car. So they think that's a way for people to hold on to the Ford name and then continue to be able to drive their car and continue to upgrade some of the features. So like we talked a little bit about it, some of the decisions they're making and looking at is they're recognizing that EV is the future. In 2030, about 40% of Ford's vehicles are expected to be electric vehicles. Within the next 5 years, they expect to produce 2 million electric vehicles a year. So to give you an idea, 2 years ago, they produced 4 million cars altogether. So that's about 50% in the next 2 years they want to make of their vehicles that they want to make electric. So on the screen here is their differentiation strategy. They're going after the commercial vehicles. So the big van up there is the E-Transit. So they're partnering with Amazon and other commercial delivery vehicles and commercial vehicles to market them. So as you know, Ford is known for their sports utility vehicles, their trucks, and they know that's a market people trust them with. And so they're the first ones to get into the truck market ahead of Tesla, ahead of other people, because they recognize their strength is there. So they've come out with the F-Series Lightning, F-150 Lightning, and that's something that's going to be going into production this month. Next at the bottom you see their electric SUV that they have named Mustang, which is unique because Mustangs are muscle cars. That's not an electric vehicle, and this is different because they're using their Ford name and their Mustang name that has a heritage and that has a trust with customers, and using it for your new brand. And that's part of their strategy, is to use their brand to sell something different and something new. Those are some of the decisions that they've made. And I think Farley has been a big part of pushing Ford into their direction, or moving Ford into their direction. Xavier's going to talk about the next part.
All right, thank you. Hi guys, I'm Xavier. So 2020, as you all know, the pandemic hit. And at that time, electronic demand and the demand for semiconductors soared through the roof. Electronics, including laptops, video games, and the new technology on the block that's going through the roof, electric vehicles. At this time, Ford is selling their combustion engine cars at around 8.7% margin. Now they also had just put out, as Arun stated, the Mustang Mach-E, which they were selling at a loss. But they knew over time demand would high, and economies of scale would eventually catch up with that, and they would become profitable with that. But the big deal on the block was the semiconductor issue. So, what was their plan and what strategy did they come up with? They decided to restructure. As he said, now they have the Model E, which Jim Farley now has as the electric part, and Ford Blue, which goes back to the combustion engine, which is why they're still profitable today. They can't just throw that away and go straight into electric vehicles. They have to find a way to maintain their legacy vehicles so they can stay afloat. So the video I'm going to show you at this time is the introduction video they came up when they announced it in March. March 2nd of this year.
We're announcing one of the largest transformations in the global automotive business. Full stop.
We have a lot of positive momentum. In many ways, Ford is on a roll. We have this opportunity of a lifetime.
This will be a really big change in modernization of the way we're going to do business.
We've decided to create two separate auto businesses. Ford Blue, that'll focus on our internal combustion engine vehicles like Bronco and F-150, and Ford Model E, which will focus on connected digital vehicles.
We're taking the best of Ford and we're unleashing it.
And it's going to enable Ford to outperform both those legacy automakers who aren't doing this and the electric vehicle competitors who don't have our assets like body engineering and large-scale manufacturing. Why now? This is the single biggest opportunity to change, to win. Ford Model E will take a clean sheet approach. It'll empower innovation and deliver a breakthrough electric vehicle portfolio, but do it at millions of vehicles of scale.
Model E will be responsible also to develop software and technologies that are delivered to all parts of the Ford enterprise, not just EVs.
And then there's connectivity on top of it, bringing services and experiences to our customers on a regular basis, making their vehicles better.
To really create something that's breakthrough, that's going to differentiate Ford and Lincoln and create another century of prosperity for our company.
Ford Blue will build out Ford's vibrant portfolio of internal combustion powered vehicles.
Bronco and Ranger and F-150, Super Duty, Mustang, those vehicles aren't going anywhere.
I want to emphasize that. We are going to invest in internal combustion engines.
And Ford Blue is going to be the profit engine of Ford, delivering the lifeblood to fund our future.
We're going all in for our customers. We're creating insanely great vehicles.
So it's really about the best of both worlds. These two separate businesses come together and we get to harness the strengths of both.
The Ford Blue and the Model E families of vehicle brands, they're going to strengthen each other. The capabilities and technologies are going to flow from one to the other business, and that's just not possible for our competitors. Ford Blue and Model E will be supported by Ford Pro, Ford Drive, our mobility business, of course, Lincoln brand, and Ford Credit.
To sum it up, we're all in. We're spending $5 billion on BEVs in 2022. We're increasing our overall capital allocation to BEVs, while also continuing to invest in our iconic nameplates on the ICE side of the business. As we do that, we will sharpen how we allocate capital and what we expect in return. The stakes are high, but so are our ambitions. A 10% company adjusted EBIT margin with more than 2 million EVs, which is 1/3 of our global vehicle volume within 4 years.
What I see in the eyes of my teammates, from the factory floor to the C-suite, everyone in between, is that they recognize that it's time to change at Ford. That Ford has an opportunity like it has not had for almost 100 years, but it will require change. And if we embrace that change, the company's future will be sustainable, and that gives us all purpose. We're announcing one of the largest transformations.
All right, quick question for you guys. Who thinks this is a viable strategy going forward for Ford? Go ahead.
Oh, I just, two thumbs up. I feel like, starting a company that way never seems to really work. But I feel like we've seen it a lot we were just talking about Google last week and Alphabet.
Right.
And once you get to that point where you have so many different things going on, I think it makes more sense for them to split it than having just this big jumbled mess where, production's not the same in those vehicles and there's a lot of differences.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to handle those differences separately while still having it under the main company, I feel like that would work.
Okay. Go ahead, Felicia.
I think a lot of people see electric cars as like the future, right? It's the inevitability at this point, right? It's just like, when do we get there? Like anything, it's a slow transition, right? You don't just jump onto the train. So being able to have these two companies, so Ford Blue can like subsidize Model E, and then while it's building and the world's changing and things are progressing more towards electric vehicles, right? It can support it until it probably eventually will be absorbed by it. So I think it's a smart idea.
Okay, I agree. Had a hand over here. Go ahead, Jamie.
So I feel a bit opposite. I feel like this is really a little too late. Too little, too late coming from Ford. The strategy might have been innovative and forward-looking maybe 10 years ago, but at this point it seems really reactionary. It concerns me a bit. You know, I personally having strong opinions about Ford, but you know.
So I agree with you on the wait time as well, because a lot of their competitors have already secured a lot of their supply chain and already acquired a lot of the talent that's required for this so far, while other engineering students are still in school and still has to get time to build experience. So I think it's a good idea, but also I think they waited a little too long as well. But that's why I go back to the first point, new talent acquisition for innovation and flexibility. So Ford wants the flexibility of a new startup. So they want to be able to advertise the new engineers coming out of school. Hey, we want battery production. We want you to research new battery cells, anodes, cathodes, and new types of dry cell electrolytes, a new infotainment, and also they're also going towards full self-driving as well. Everybody wants autonomous cars as well. So this is where Ford is heading, like Felicia said earlier, that their strategy here is pretty much to have them subsidize this until they can get the talent needed in the future. Let's see, Ford Blue is profitable currently in the company as the Model E ramps. Model E can focus on securing EV supply chain and gives adequate reasons to limit production. So Ford has shareholders and big firms that fund the company so far. When everyone has the same excuse as far as semiconductor, oh, we put out and we were gonna produce 500,000 cars this year and we only managed to pull out 80,000. That excuse kind of gets old as competitors continue to push forward when they have the talent to change firmware within semiconductors and keep moving forward, while we're stuck here with just keep the shortage. So as they siloed their company, they're able to have this excuse as, hey, we're ramping our new EVs. We're still profitable on this side, so give us time to build out this factory, give us time to get the talent, give us time to secure the supply chain and get the new semiconductors needed, and we can push this company forward into the future. So the CEO said, I want to emphasize that we are going to invest in internal combustion engine. I have another question for you. How long do you think they should continue investing into the internal combustion engine? As long as it's profitable? Okay. Go ahead, James.
So, you know, with a heritage brand like Ford, I see there being potential for continued investment in ICEs. If you think about a future where everybody's driving an electric car, everybody's driving a self-driving vehicle, I still want to get behind the wheel of a real car, and I want to hear some real noise.
Yeah.
You know, you could double down on a Mustang GT or whatever, and this becomes a hyper luxury product. I don't know.
Yeah. Honestly, I drive a GT myself. I like the noise that comes from it, but the minute I experienced the infotainment and all the new software that came with the Volkswagen ID4 or the Tesla Model 3, kind of didn't care for it anymore. As long as it's like, you know, like making that transition to the smartphone for the first time, like, yeah, I really don't care to have the cord on me in the house anymore, you know? So, I mean, that's just how I felt personally. So, if I continue to produce ICE vehicles, means less EVs, which has less chip requirements. So on average, the new EV cars require 2,000 semiconductors, and your ICE vehicles only require 1,000. As we demonstrated here, even turn signals need semiconductors, infotainment needs some semiconductors. Your ABS system for your brakes need semiconductors. All the fog lights need semiconductors. So pretty much the modern day car, whether it's the EVs or ICE, are just computers on wheels. But when it comes to production, I think this is a good strategy as well to say we're going to invest in our ICE vehicles because we can produce more here, and we can only use on average 1,000 semiconductors in one ICE vehicle besides putting 2,000 in just one EV and lose money on this side. As we continue to ramp and we become more profitable and the supply chain gets secured, we can continue to be more efficient with the semiconductors on the ICE side. And lastly, allows for the time to manage expectations while securing more chip supplies. So global share of EVs has increased on average 50%. This wasn't expected 10 years ago, to James' point. EV adoption is soaring. The Chinese company BYD is selling, because the country of China is the biggest vehicle market on the planet. And they are incentivizing in every single way to make all their cars electric, at least by 2035. We now have states in the US who are now putting out guidance that by 2035 that their automakers are gonna have to stop manufacturing ICE vehicles. So adoption is gonna be a little bit unpredictable, but the speed in which the adoption rate and people are even catching on, only even by word of mouth, is staggering. You guys can look this up later as well. And during the Super Bowl, there were many EVs, new EVs, such as Polestar, who advertised during the Super Bowl, and they inadvertently gave Tesla a big spike in sales, although they did not advertise. So people are comparing, and people are saying, hey, you know, electric vehicles that's the future. Let's compare notes, who has the best specs, who has the best price range, who has a supply chain, and they're choosing what looks good to them and what fits their pocket. So at this time, I'll pass it off to Caitlin, and she'll go deeper into this subject. Thank you.
So I'll be talking about Ford, more of their history, how they developed their products over their history basically, and then how they got to the point of the F-150 Lightning and how they compare to their competitors today. So Henry Ford started in 1896 by building the quadricycle, which is right there. That is a quadricycle, a bicycle that has two gears that can only go forward. You can steer left and right, but there is no reverse. So it's really the first step to today's modern vehicle. In 1903, of course, the Ford Motor Company was incorporated and founded, and that led them to 1908 with the Model T, right here, the first vehicle. So that was introduced, and they produced 15 million until 1927. And Henry Ford's main goal with that vehicle was to make a reliable and easy to maintain vehicle for Americans. It was obviously very expensive back then because it was 1908. But over time, when they used the integrated assembly line, they were able to reduce the time that it took from 12.5 hours to assemble a Model T down to an hour and a half. So it really sped up their production, cut their costs down, which allowed the vehicle to be more attainable to more Americans, and thus really started their foothold with the blue collar workers for today. So in 1917, the first truck was produced, which is the Model TT shown here. Is basically just the Model T with an extended cab or bed for truck. They wanted it for farmers because they saw that there was a need for it. So that's why that started being produced. And then in 1927 came the Model A, which was the first vehicle that was actually produced with the Ford oval, and the first vehicle with a windshield. So as Ford started innovating their vehicles and producing more technologically advanced vehicles, they were the ones who started out with the first windshield and the first seatbelts, and I'll go into that further. So in 1942, as we talked about earlier, the World War II was happening, and Ford actually halted all their civilian production in order to produce all equipment. This is just a fun fact, but all equipment for the military, and that's where Rosie the Riveter started. She was a rivet gun operator in one of their production plants, and they used her as a ad campaign for the war. So that's where Rosie the Riveter came from, was from Ford. And then 1948 is when the F-Series of trucks was introduced, beginning in 1982, that's when the F-Series became the best-selling vehicle in America and is still that way today. In 1956, Ford went public. They were the largest IPO in history at that time, so it was a really big thing for them. I missed a point in history here. 1954, this was just personal for me, the Thunderbird was introduced, and I grew up, my dad drove a Thunderbird, so that was cool to learn. And then Ford started actually crash testing their vehicles, and they were one of the first automakers to do that as well. So that brings us to the 1986, the modular assembly line was introduced to the St. Louis plant. That is what's used today in most automakers, but Ford was the first to do it, and that's how they are assembling their new F-150 Lightning. So in 1996, as we're talking about electric vehicles, they actually produced the Ford Ranger electric vehicle. It had lead acid batteries and regenerative braking. It didn't, it had some charge to it, it got you some mileage, but it was really the first electric vehicle that would be known for like today. That's where it really started, was with Ford's 1996 electric Ranger. And then in 2014, they revolutionized the F-150 by introducing the all-aluminum body, which cut down 750 pounds from the truck weight. Again, it was a more expensive material at the time because it was new, but it cut down costs over time. Shipping, obviously the truck is now 750 pounds lighter, and it became more popular with customers, and so they started upgrading and then thus turned a profit with this more expensive material. So 2019, the Mustang Mach-E debuts, and as Haroon mentioned earlier, it is not the Mustang that we all think it is. They really stamp Mustang on there for clout. Everyone knows what a Mustang is, so when they said, oh, we're gonna make an electric Mustang, it got all the hype, but a little disappointment at the end of it. Still popular. And then 2021 was when the F-150 Lightning was announced, and they started producing just this past month. So the F-150 Lightning, so the concept development began actually 4 years ago. The chief engineer, Linda Jung, she wanted to make a fully electric vehicle without losing any of the towing capabilities that the F-Series trucks were known for. So they made one of the big things that they wanted to introduce to the F-150 Lightning is the frunk. That's a front trunk. They also tried to coin the term of front gating. You have a party in the back, party in the front, but it didn't really take up with marketing. I'm disappointed in that. They're not really trying the front gating, party in the front, angle. The truck, as soon as the concept came out, the big question for Ford was, well, how much can this F-150 tow? And so they put out a YouTube video of the chief engineer towing 1.25 million pounds for 1,000 feet. Basically just to say, this is what this truck can do, stop asking us what the truck can do. But they ultimately said that the safest towing amount is 10,000 pounds. And so the reservations, they only took 20,000 reservations. I mean, it's kind of a lot. But 70% of the reservations were, not only were they new Ford owners, but they were new truck owners as well. So it's really popular. They're obviously bringing in a whole new market to their company with this truck alone. Okay, and so the Ford versus competition. So Ford noticed that a lot of the early starts on the electric vehicles were sedans, and the popular car in America is crossovers, SUVs, and trucks. That's what most Americans prefer to drive. So that's why their first vehicle was the Mustang Mach-E SUV crossover. You can look up here, compare that there's 4 different models that Tesla has. They have an SUV and a sedan, but it's quite costly. Ford has their 2, which are much more, and this is the range of like both vehicles or all vehicles listed in general. So it is easier starting point for people who are trying to jump into the electric game, because it is, seen as kind of an unattainable thing. It is a luxury item that came out just a couple of years ago. So Hayden kind of talked about it with the chip shortages and how each company is dealing with it. And Tesla, their thing was to just rewrite their chip software and raise prices, and that worked for them. Ford signed the deal with Global Foundries to make their strategic alliance to continue their production of their electric vehicles. Volkswagen has announced that they're going to reduce their lineup by over 60% over the next 8 years. This is twofold. They're known as being the people's car, but they now want to become a luxury line, so they're cutting out a lot of their well-known models that are cheap. They want to keep their more expensive lines in there, and they want to go more electric. So that's why they're cutting that down. And then GMC, Chevy, which holds GMC, Buick, Cadillac, Hummer, all of them, they just had that strategic alliance signing with Global Foundries as well, and so they'll start being able to produce more electric vehicles as time goes. And so I'll turn this over to Danielle.
Thanks, Kate. All right, so real quickly, I'm going to take us through the PESTEL analysis as it pertains to the automotive industry. As we know, as we talked about in this class, I think even Michael did his ITA on it. This is looking at external factors and how they impact the industry. Next slide. So for starting with political, the president has asked Congress to pass the CHIPS Act, which is $52 billion worth of subsidies to give to all the chip manufacturers like Global Foundries for them to expand their factories. You can already see up here that, and I think Hayden talked about in the beginning, that in anticipation of these funds, Global Foundries has already began their expansion in Malta, New York. And so hopefully, once everyone, and I couldn't find a breakdown of who's going to get what type of allocation of the $52 billion, but I know that the focus is going to be the semiconductor solutions for the advanced driver assistance systems, the battery management systems, and the in-vehicle networking. This is a big deal because 20 years ago, America led the globe, and we had 40% of all chip manufacturing coming from the US. Now, as it stands, we are only stand at 12%. So in an effort to compete with China, the president's pushing Congress to approve this bill so that we can be more competitive and really more self-sustainable, as COVID proved that we are not. Next slide. Going into the economic front, everyone here is experiencing high inflation rates and interest rates, which essentially affects our consumer spending. As our price caps decrease, we want to hold on to some of our money. Spending is getting a little more tight. They're not going to be looking at luxury electric vehicles potentially, right? And then supply chain disruptions. We talked about the microchips, but especially the war in Ukraine. So they had factories in Ukraine that were producing niche components for each vehicle. So Mercedes and Audi had a wiring harness that they can no longer get because that factory shut down. Ford had a info entertainment screen for the new Ford Focus. It was 12.3 inches. They can no longer get that. So in an effort to keep rolling cars off the lot, they're going with an 8-inch screen instead. And then all of this, again, is just going to go to that limited production and low inventory, which is going to drive those prices up. Over the last year, we've seen car prices increase 8%. And to some of those, I have like 5 vehicles, I have a 69 Mustang, no impact on my, on a doomsday vehicle. But if I were to try to go get a new Chevy Suburban, I'm looking at a down payment on a house, like 110 grand for a new Chevy Suburban. So I'll not be getting one of those. On the social front, again, these are all the trends that us as consumers want to see in our cars, right? So the electric vehicle is obviously a must, so we've been talking about that. But the autonomous drive, I think, is a big one. As consumers, it's a convenience piece, but as if you're in the business world, that's helping you with that last mile. And all of this, I think, collectively is just paying towards less negligence on the road, right? That's what we want to see, less negligence. And then the connectivity, we want to interact with our cars in the same way that we interact with our laptops, the same way that we interact with our phones. And so that's a big piece, it's an expensive piece. And the shared mobility, NC did a presentation, was it this class? About car sharing?
Yes.
Yes, so talking about car sharing, and then if you've been to big cities in the US, I haven't been to Seattle in a minute, but I have been to Kansas City as of late, and they have all the electric scooters, the bird scooters. So car sharing and electric scooters as viable options, all of which decrease the number of cars on the road, which could impact, again, the car industry if we're not seeing that, the need to buy new cars. Next slide. Moving to technology, AI is a big one, and they feed into like Google Cloud, the Symbio robotics, and that's just how that increases the workplace, how that affects the workplace for businesses, and then all the manufacturing. And Xavier talked about the manufacturing. And then there's just the things like 3D printing and cruise foam. Cruise foam is just another way that Ford's looking at how to make parts that are lighter, more durable. 3D printing is, I think, a more important piece, because if you've ever been to any type of welding or machining, it's getting rid of those CNC machines. So it's going to be cheaper, faster, less wait times, because you can do those in-house. And then the vehicle data analytics, again, just connecting us with our cars. And that's the more flexibility. Environmental, I thought this was big, so I got both of these charts from the EPA's website. I want to focus right here on transportation. The 27% of that, about 15% makes up all of our long and short haul vehicles, so the semis you see on the roads, those reefer trucks, your vehicles, and we make up 15% of all the CO2 emissions today, which is actually, if you're looking at the pie chart, that's more than commercial and residential, more than agricultural, and then, I mean, everyone needs electricity, so I don't think that's self-explanatory. And then the industry, again, that plays in the manufacturing piece, so we play a pretty big role. But if you're looking at the U.S. total, you see here about like 2019 we had a peak. I mean, we're obviously not like over here in 2009, but 2019 was pretty significant. We saw an increase. 2020 we declined due to COVID, but as we come out of COVID, 2022, 2023, we're starting to increase again, and I would even argue that we're plateauing. So I wouldn't say that CO2 emissions is necessarily a big deal as we push for that environmental. However, the piece that's not on the slide is going to be all the raw materials in support of making those batteries for the electric vehicles. That's a finite resource, as is petroleum. So we're gonna fight over those two and what's going to be sustainable. Next slide. Legal. Starting off with product liability. Again, as the electric vehicle becomes more prominent on the market, we're going to start talking about battery fires, the recalls, and then the autonomous technologies, which I thought was really interesting. So if you get in a car accident and you have your auto drive on, who's going to be liable in that instance? It's going to be a big deal. Now, we already talked about supply chain, but I thought what was interesting is the supply contracts. We didn't see too much of this in the news, but as we come out of COVID, and we're really not coming out of it, I think some of these things are compounding as time goes on. Those suppliers and the manufacturers are kind of going back and forth on who's financially responsible for some of these backlogs. Some people are holding a lot of inventory, some are not, and so we're going to start seeing that come out. I want to skip down here to cybersecurity. This is in Tony's field, but I thought this was a big deal as far as manufacturing a smart car, because you're basically driving a computer now, and so you have to protect against cyber attacks. And so how in your manufacturing process do you account for those things? So there are the road vehicle cybersecurity engineering. You can find this on the ISO's website, but it doesn't specify specific technology, how you should or should not use it. It just gives like best practices, but it is something that came out in August of 2021 that car manufacturers do have to adhere to. Furthermore, if they're looking at going to Japan or Korea or anywhere in the UK, they have their own standards. Like it's UN R155, and so they have additional layer of regulation that they're going to have to adhere to when looking at manufacturing. And so, after hearing our entire presentation, what do you think? Is Ford first on race day, or are they found on road day?
First on
John.
I feel like all cars are kind of found on road day, like, in general,
Yes.
but some more than the others. But I think one thing I found interesting, and one thing I still think, I'm more in the line of, I mean, if you've ever driven an electric car, they can get insanely fast. And I think maybe like 19-year-old me would be trying to jailbreak that thing to see if you could get it 0 to 60 in like 1 second. But that is one of the things I'm really thinking about. It's like, yeah, I think it's adoptable, but I still like and think there's a market for internal combustion engines, and I think that they did a good job by keeping it separate, you know, because the CEO talks about heritage. I think that's part of the heritage of being an automobile, is having that capability there, you know, whether it's for enthusiasts or for actual work that needs to be done. But I was always concerned with the infrastructure, you know, if they do produce that many cars within 5 years, and we all buy into it, like when like 20% of them break or something like that, where are we gonna take them? You know, or like if your kids break down like on a road trip or something, how are you gonna get them? Like those kinds of things are the kinds of things I'm really worried about, is the infrastructure piece. You know, I think it's a challenge that hopefully, you know, as general car manufacturers, they're coming together to provide a more solid solution that we can have quickly, rather than you know, put these things on the market and then have to catch up with it later.
Yeah, it definitely takes all that convenience away from like helping yourself.
Yeah,
and,
direct to fix.
Exactly. I can change my own oil, I can do pretty much anything I need to do on my car. I can pull the engine and rebuild it. I can bore everything out. I can do all that. I don't know what I'm doing with this electric vehicle when it breaks down. I think then at that point it's found on road dead for sure, and that goes like you
I
said.
hate being like that, because when your parents tell you that, you're like, oh, it's never gonna break, but then you know that one time.
Well, it plays into what you said. It's with the right to repair too. It's also battery systems are simpler than internal combustion engines on paper, but all the management systems are proprietary to the owner. So you can't jailbreak it.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
Exactly.
you void your warranty, and the car's, if it is found on road dead, you're on the road dead. There's nothing you can do.
Yeah. Anyone else? NC.
Sorry. I think with all manufacturers going through the chip shortage as well, it doesn't necessarily give Ford an advantage. But right now it's like an arms race as far as the EV goes, or the electric. As far as that I guess spectrum of the industry, it's literally an arms race. I think you posted all the competitors, and many of them that we see. Tesla obviously dominates the market right now, but there's many of the big companies. Hyundai have like 3 ones that you have there, you know. Two? Okay. The last one had 3 of them there. But anyways.
No, you're right, it is 3.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's just an arms race right now, so it's difficult to tell whether they're first on race day or found on the road dead, because nobody's there yet.
It is difficult, I agree. Jessica.
I was just curious, you'd mentioned briefly, you know, obviously there's finite resources when you're manufacturing the batteries. I feel like what hasn't, obviously emissions as far as like combustion engine goes, that is like glaringly obvious. But since we haven't really ramped up this whole electric vehicle thing, I think there's a lot of unknown out there in like the effects on the environment of mining the lithium, manufacturing the batteries creates a lot of pollution. And it was a few years ago, and I have no like concrete information on it, but I had read something about they still have no idea how we're going to recycle these batteries when the time comes. And I feel like there's no company addressing it. Everyone's like racing, you know, to be first in line to be the electric car company. But I feel like at some point, like, we're gonna have to address that too, you know?
Yeah, and that's kind of how I felt about electric vehicles, because it's not, grass isn't always greener.
Right.
Right, and so I did actually read an article where this entity was arguing that electric vehicles have the same type of emissions as combustion vehicles do, and that there's really nothing, it's not any better, but it is a different option, so we're not fully exhausting our petroleum resources. So I personally don't think we're ever gonna get rid of petroleum vehicles, and we're not fully gonna go to electric. It's not feasible with our finite resources on the globe. So I think it's great to push it on people for a profit. I mean, I don't really think it's great, but I mean, that's what they're doing. I don't advocate for that, but eventually everyone's gonna come back, and my 69 Mustang will still be relevant, so.
So, actually, there's a few companies who's recently accepted within the last 4 years. One's called Red Wool Materials, and their main objective is to close the loop for the supply chain for electric vehicles. And so they mainly collect nickel and lithium and a few more raw materials as well. And to your point about mining as well, there's a lot of new techniques to mine lithium, pick up the dirt, extract the lithium with eco-friendly materials, and then put the dirt back exactly the way you found it. There's a lot of, especially in America, there's a lot of reservations as well where people don't want you to touch it. So if you do choose to come and get materials out of their land, they want it the same way they found it.
Yeah.
So, but to your point, yeah.
I always think it's interesting. Do you ever think it's really the same way that they found it though? Like, I always feel like it's such a loose term. It's just an excuse to, I'll put your dirt and rocks back exactly the way they've been there for 400 years. Probably not.
Yeah, the main thing,
it'll look nice.
Yeah, they just don't want a giant hole.
Yeah, right.
in the land.
I still want my house to sink in it, you know,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, another thing on that, like some of the old hybrid batteries put is actually collecting them, and Yellowstone, they're repurposing them, so as like energy storage with solar power for running some of the facilities there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I had a question, Xavier, you mentioned companies closing the loop on EVs. You folks presented Ford as investing in ICEs. I've heard about other companies investing in ICEs from the perspective of carbon capture and biofuel technology to sort of close the loop there on carbon. Do you know if Ford is moving in that direction when they say investment?
And
It's vague.
I didn't read anything about them doing the biotech now.
No, nothing about carbon capture. Even Toyota gave up on hydrogen.
Yeah, I think California is the only state left that still even has hydrogen pumps.
Okay, so carbon and hydrogen are a little different.
Tell me, chemist.
Okay.
Explain to me.
What I've heard, just for context, I suppose, is that BMW is investing in taking the carbon dioxide out of the air and synthesizing fuel from that carbon. So essentially it goes in a circle.
Oh, no.
That's what they're doing with the freight ships, aren't they?
Something like that.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. I haven't seen that put into a car yet. I see it more towards freight.
Yeah.
Thanks for dumbing that down so I can.
It kind of just goes to Jessica's point too. It's just sort of where electric cars place. On paper, they're better for the environment, but it's really where, like, if you own an electric car, you no longer are the polluter, but your energy plant is, depending on where you get your energy from. So it just kind of shifts it up a totem pole, kind of, to the next person that's polluting on your behalf, kind of.
I think the advantage that an electric plant has is that you have one location where you can use resources to keep your emissions down, versus like 100 million cars out there polluting everywhere. So your ability to scale and be able to regulate that is a lot more feasible than trying to regulate it at every single location wherever the car goes. There are some benefits. Potentially, I think it'll get better with time.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.